Indian Economic Development by NCERT. Unit 1. Development Policies in Experience, 1947–90. The two chapters in this unit give us an overview of the state of the Indian economy as it was at the eve of independence till after 4 decades of planned development, which was a path that India chose. This meant that the Government of India had to take a series of steps such as the establishment of the Planning Commission and announcement of 5-year plans. An overview of the goals of 5-year plans and a critical appraisal of the merits and limitations of planned development has been covered in this unit. 1. Indian Economy. On the eve of independence. After studying this chapter, the learners will become familiar with the state of the Indian economy in 1947, the year of India's independence. Understand the factors that led to the underdevelopment and stagnation of the Indian economy. India is the pivot of our empire. If the empire loses any other part of its dominion, we can survive, but if we lose India, the sun of our empire will have set. Victor Alexander Bruce, the Viceroy of British India in 1894. 1.1 Introduction. The primary objective of this book, Indian Economic Development, is to familiarize you with the basic features of the Indian economy, and its development, as it is today, in the aftermath of independence. However, it is equally important to know something about the country's economic past even as you learn about its present state and future prospects. So, let us first look at the state of India's economy prior to the country's independence and form an idea of the various considerations that shaped India's post-independence development strategy. The structure of India's present-day economy is not just of current making, it has its roots steeped in history, particularly in the period when India was under British rule, which lasted for almost 2 centuries before India finally won its independence on August 15, 1947. The sole purpose of the British colonial rule in India was to reduce the country to being a feeder economy for Great Britain's own rapidly expanding modern industrial base. An understanding of the exploitative nature of this relationship is essential for any assessment of the kind and level of development which the Indian economy has been able to attain over the last 6 decades. 1.2 Low level of economic development under the colonial rule. India had an independent economy before the advent of the British rule. Though agriculture was the main source of livelihood for most people, yet, the country's economy was characterized by various kinds of manufacturing activities. India was particularly well known for its handicraft industries in the fields of cotton and silk, textiles, metal and precious stone works etc. These products enjoyed a worldwide market based on the reputation of the fine quality of material used and the high standards of craftsmanship seen in all imports from India. The economic policies pursued by the colonial government in India were concerned more with the protection and promotion of the economic interests of their home country than with the development of the Indian economy. Such policies brought about a fundamental change in the structure of the Indian economy, transforming the country into a net supplier of raw materials and consumer of finished industrial products from Britain. Obviously, the colonial government never made any sincere attempt to estimate India's national and per capita income. Some individual attempts which were made to measure such incomes yielded conflicting and inconsistent results. Among the notable estimators Dadabhai Naoroji, William Digby, Findlay Shiraz, V. K. R. V. Rao and R. C. Desai. It was Rao whose estimates of the national and per capita incomes during the colonial period were considered very significant. However, most studies did find that the country's growth of aggregate real output during the first half of the 20th century was less than 2%, coupled with a meager 0.5% growth in per capita output per year. 1.3 Agricultural sector. India's economy under the British colonial rule remained fundamentally agrarian. About 85% of the country's population lived mostly in villages and derived livelihood directly or indirectly from agriculture. However, despite being the occupation of such a large population, the agricultural sector continued to experience stagnation and, not infrequently, unusual deterioration. Agricultural productivity became incrementally low, though, in absolute terms, the sector experienced some growth due to the expansion of the aggregate area under cultivation. This stagnation in the agricultural sector was caused mainly because of the various systems of land settlement that were introduced by the colonial government. Particularly, under the zamindari system, which was implemented in the then Bengal Presidency comprising parts of India's present-day eastern states, the profit accruing out of the agriculture sector went to the zamindars instead of the cultivators. However, a considerable number of zamindars, and not just the colonial government, did nothing to improve the condition of agriculture. The main interest of the zamindars was only to collect rent. Regardless of the economic condition of the cultivators, this caused immense misery and social tension among the latter. To a very great extent, the terms of the revenue settlement were also responsible for the zamindars adopting such an attitude. Dates for depositing specified sums of revenue were fixed, failing which the zamindars were to lose their rights. Besides this, low levels of technology, lack of irrigation facilities and negligible use of fertilizers, all added up to aggravate the plight of the farmers and contributed to the dismal level of agricultural productivity. There was, of course, some evidence of a relatively higher yield of cash crops in certain areas of the country due to commercialization of agriculture. But this could hardly help farmers in improving their economic condition as, instead of producing food crops, now they were producing cash crops which were to be ultimately used by British industries back home. India's agricultural production received a further setback due to the country's partition at the time of independence. A sizable portion of the undivided country's highly irrigated and fertile land went to Pakistan. This had an adverse impact upon India's output from the agriculture sector. Particularly affected was India's jute industry, since almost the whole of the jute producing area became part of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. India's jute goods industry, in which the country had enjoyed a world monopoly so far, thus, suffered heavily for lack of raw material. 1.4 Industrial sector. As in the case of agriculture, so also in manufacturing, India could not develop a sound industrial base under the colonial rule. Even as the country's world-famous handicraft industries declined, no corresponding modern industrial base was allowed to come up to take pride of place so long enjoyed by the former. The primary motive of the colonial government behind this policy of systematically deindustrializing India was twofold. The intention was, first, to reduce India to the status of a mere exporter of important raw materials for the upcoming modern industries in Britain and, second, to turn India into a sprawling market for the finished products of those industries so that their continued expansion could be ensured to the maximum advantage of their home country Britain. In the unfolding economic scenario, the decline of the indigenous handicraft industries created not only massive unemployment in India but also a new demand in the Indian consumer market, which was now deprived of the supply of locally made goods. This demand was profitably met by the increasing imports of cheap manufactured goods from Britain. During the second half of the 19th century, modern industry began to take root in India, but its progress remained very slow. Initially, this development was confined to the setting up of cotton and jute textile mills. The cotton textile mills, mainly dominated by Indians, were located in the western parts of the country, namely, Maharashtra and Gujarat, while the jute mills dominated by the foreigners were mainly concentrated in Bengal. Subsequently, the iron and steel industries began coming up in the beginning of the 20th century. The Tata Iron and Steel Company, TISCO, was incorporated in 1907. A few other industries in the fields of sugar, cement, paper etc. came up after the Second World War. However, there was hardly any capital goods industry to help promote further industrialization in India. Capital goods industry means industries which can produce machine tools which are, in turn, used for producing articles for current consumption. The establishment of a few manufacturing units here and there was no substitute to the near wholesale displacement of the country's traditional handicraft industries. Furthermore, the growth rate of the new industrial sector and its contribution to the gross domestic product, GDP, remained very small. Another significant drawback of the new industrial sector was the very limited area of operation of the public sector. This sector remained confined only to the railways, power generation, communications, ports and some other departmental undertakings. 1.5 Foreign trade. India has been an important trading nation since ancient times. But the restrictive policies of commodity production, trade, and tariff pursued by the colonial government adversely affected the structure, composition and volume of India's foreign trade. Consequently, India became an exporter of primary products such as raw silk, cotton, wool, sugar, indigo, jute etc. and an importer of finished consumer goods like cotton, silk and woolen clothes and capital goods like light machinery produced in the factories of Britain. For all practical purposes, Britain maintained a monopoly control over India's exports and imports. As a result, more than half of India's foreign trade was restricted to Britain while the rest was allowed with a few other countries like China, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Persia, Iran. The opening of the Suez Canal further intensified British control over India's foreign trade. The most important characteristic of India's foreign trade throughout the colonial period was the generation of a large export surplus. But this surplus came at a huge cost to the country's economy. Several essential commodities, food grains, clothes, kerosene etc. became conspicuous by their acute scarcity in the domestic market. Furthermore, this export surplus did not result in any flow of gold or silver into India. Rather, this was used to make payments for the expenses incurred by an office set up by the colonial government in Britain, expenses on war, again fought by the British government, and the import of invisible items, all of which led to the drain of Indian wealth. 1.6 Demographic condition. Various details about the population of British India were first collected through a census in 1881. Though suffering from certain limitations, it revealed the unevenness in India's population growth. Subsequently, every 10 years such census operations were carried out. Before 1921, India was in the first stage of demographic transition. The second stage of transition began after 1921. However, neither the total population of India nor the rate of population growth at this stage was very high. The various social development indicators were also not quite encouraging. The overall literacy level was less than 16%. Out of this, the female literacy level was at a negligible low of about 7%. Public health facilities were either unavailable to large chunks of population or, when available, were highly inadequate. Consequently, water and airborne diseases were rampant and took a huge toll on life. No wonder, the overall mortality rate was very high, and in that particularly, the infant mortality rate was quite alarming, about 218 per thousand in contrast to the present infant mortality rate of 63 per thousand. Life expectancy was also very low, 32 years in contrast to the present 63 years. In the absence of reliable data, it is difficult to specify the extent of poverty at that time, but there is no doubt that extensive poverty prevailed in India during the colonial period, which contributed to the worsening profile of India's population of the time. 1.7 Occupational structure. During the colonial period, the occupational structure of India, i.e., distribution of working persons across different industries and sectors, showed little sign of change. The agricultural sector accounted for the largest share of workforce, which usually remained at a high of 70.75%, while the manufacturing and the services sectors accounted for only 10 and 15.20% respectively. Another striking aspect was the growing regional variation. Parts of the then Madras Presidency, comprising areas of the present-day states of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, and Karnataka, Maharashtra and West Bengal, witnessed a decline in the dependence of the workforce on the agricultural sector, with a commensurate increase in the manufacturing and the services sectors. However, there had been an increase in the share of workforce in agriculture during the same time in states such as Orissa, Rajasthan, and Punjab. 1.8 Infrastructure. Under the colonial regime, basic infrastructure such as railways, ports, water transport, posts and telegraphs did develop. However, the real motive behind this development was not to provide basic amenities to the people, but to subserve various colonial interests. Roads constructed in India prior to the advent of the British rule were not fit for modern transport. The colonial administration also could not accomplish much on this front due to a paucity of funds. The roads that were built primarily served the purposes of mobilizing the army within India and drawing out raw materials from the countryside to the nearest railway station or the port to send these to faraway England or other lucrative foreign destinations. There always remained an acute shortage of all-weather roads to reach out to the rural areas during the rainy season. Naturally, therefore, people mostly living in these areas suffered grievously during natural calamities and famines. The British introduced the railways in India in 1850, and it is considered as one of their most important contributions. The railways affected the structure of the Indian economy in two important ways. On the one hand, it enabled people to undertake long-distance travel and thereby break geographical and cultural barriers, while, on the other hand, it fostered commercialization of Indian agriculture, which adversely affected the comparative self-sufficiency of the village economies in India. The volume of India's export trade undoubtedly expanded, but its benefits rarely accrued to the Indian people. The social benefits, which they cost to the government exchequer, yet, it failed to compete with the railways, which soon traversed the region running parallel to the canal, and had to be ultimately abandoned. The introduction of the expensive system of electric telegraph in India, similarly, served the purpose of maintaining law and order. The postal services, on the other hand, despite serving a useful public purpose, remained all through inadequate. You will learn more about the present status of various infrastructure in Chapter 8. 1.9 Conclusion. By the time India won its independence, the impact of the two-century-long British colonial rule was already showing on all aspects of the Indian economy. The agricultural sector was already saddled with surplus labor and extremely low productivity. The industrial sector was crying for modernization, diversification, capacity building, and increased public investment. Foreign trade was oriented to feed the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Infrastructure facilities, including the famed railway network, needed upgradation, expansion, and public orientation. Prevalence of rampant poverty and unemployment required welfare orientation of public economic policy. In a nutshell, the social and economic challenges before the country were enormous. Recap. An understanding of the economy before independence is necessary to know and appreciate the level of development achieved during the post-independence period. Under the colonial dispensation, the economic policies of the government were concerned more with the protection and promotion of British economic interests than with the need to develop the economic condition of the colonized country and its people. The agricultural sector continued to experience stagnation and incremental deterioration despite the fact that the largest section of Indian population depended on it for sustenance. Systematic policies pursued by the British India government led to the collapse of India's world-famous handicraft industries without contributing, in any significant manner, to its replacement by a modern industrial base. Lack of adequate public health facilities, occurrence of frequent natural calamities and famines pauperized the hapless Indian people and resulted in engendering high mortality rates. Some efforts were made by the colonial regime to improve infrastructure facilities, but these efforts were spiced with selfish motives though, in the long run, the independent Indian government built on this base the country's future economic and social development plan. Box 1.1 Textile industry in Bengal. Muslin is a type of cotton textile which had its origin in Bengal, particularly, places in and around Dhaka, spelled during the pre-independence period as Dhaka, now the capital city of Bangladesh. Dhaka muslin had gained worldwide fame as an exquisite type of cotton textile. The finest variety of muslin was called Malmal. Sometimes, foreign travelers also used to refer to it as Malmal Shahi or Malmal Khas, implying that it was worn by, or fit for, the royalty. Box 1.2 Agriculture during pre-British India. The French traveller, Berny, described 17th-century Bengal in the following way: "The knowledge I have acquired of Bengal in 2 visits inclines me to believe that it is richer than Egypt. It exports, in abundance, cottons and silks, rice, sugar, and butter. It produces amply for its own consumption wheat, vegetables, grains, fowls, ducks, and geese. It has immense herds of pigs and flocks of sheep and goats. Fish of every kind it has in profusion. From Rajmahal to the sea is an endless number of canals, cut in bygone ages from the Ganges by immense labour for navigation and irrigation." Box 1.3 Trade through the Suez Canal. Suez Canal is an artificial waterway running from north to south across the Isthmus of Suez in northeastern Egypt. It connects Port Said on the Mediterranean Sea with the Gulf of Suez, an arm of the Red Sea. The canal provides a direct trade route for ships operating between European or American ports and ports located in South Asia, East Africa, and Oceania by doing away with the need to sail around Africa. Strategically and economically, it is one of the most important waterways in the world. Its opening in 1869 reduced the cost of transportation and made access to the Indian market easier. 2. Indian economy. 1950 to 1990. After studying this chapter, the learners will come to know the goals of India's 5-year plans. Know about the development policies in different sectors such as agriculture and industry from 1950 to 1990. Learn to think about the merits and limitations of a regulated economy. The central objective of planning in India is to initiate a process of development which will raise the living standards and open out to the people new opportunities for a richer and more varied life. First 5-year plan. 2.1 Introduction. On August 15, 1947, India woke to a new dawn of freedom. Finally we were masters of our own destiny after some 200 years of British rule. The job of nation building was now in our own hands. The leaders of independent India had to decide, among other things, the type of economic system most suitable for our nation, a system which would promote the welfare of all rather than a few. There are different types of economic systems and among them, socialism appealed to Jawaharlal Nehru the most. However, he was not in favor of the kind of socialism established in the former Soviet Union where all the means of production, i.e., all the factories and farms in the country, were owned by the government. There was no private property. It is not possible in a democracy like India for the government to change the ownership pattern of land and other properties of its citizens in the way that it was done in the former Soviet Union. Nehru, and many other leaders and thinkers of the newly independent India, sought an alternative to the extreme versions of capitalism and socialism. Basically sympathizing with the socialist outlook, they found the answer in an economic system which, in their view, combined the best features of socialism without its drawbacks. In this view, India would be a socialist society with a strong public sector but also with private property and democracy. The government would plan for the economy with the private sector being encouraged to be part of the plan effort. The Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948 and the Directive Principles of the Indian Constitution reflected this outlook. In 1950, the Planning Commission was set up with the Prime Minister as its chairperson. The era of 5-year plans had begun. 2.2 The goals of 5-year plans. A plan should have some clearly specified goals. The goals of the 5-year plans are growth, modernization, self-reliance, and equity. This does not mean that all the plans have given equal importance to all these goals. Due to limited resources, a choice has to be made in each plan about which of the goals is to be given primary importance. Nevertheless, the planners have to ensure that, as far as possible, the policies of the plans do not contradict these 4 goals. Let us now learn about the goals of planning in some detail. Growth. It refers to increase in the country's capacity to produce the output of goods and services within the country. It implies either a larger stock of productive capital, or a larger size of supporting services like transport and banking, or an increase in the efficiency of productive capital and services. A good indicator of economic growth, in the language of economics, is steady increase in the gross domestic product, GDP. The GDP is the market value of all the goods and services produced in the country during a year. You can think of the GDP as a cake. Growth is increase in the size of the cake. If the cake is larger, more people can enjoy it. It is necessary to produce more goods and services if the people of India are to enjoy, in the words of the first 5-year plan, a more rich and varied life. The GDP of a country is derived from the different sectors of the economy, namely the agricultural sector, the industrial sector and the service sector. The contribution made by each of these sectors makes up the structural composition of the economy. In some countries, growth in agriculture contributes more to the GDP growth, while in some countries the growth in the service sector contributes more to GDP growth. Modernization. To increase the production of goods and services. The producers have to adopt new technology. For example, a farmer can increase the output on the farm by using new seed varieties instead of using the old ones. Similarly, a factory can increase output by using a new type of machine. Adoption of new technology is called modernization. However, modernization does not refer only to the use of new technology but also to changes in social outlook such as the recognition that women should have the same rights as men. In a traditional society, women are supposed to remain at home while men work. A modern society makes use of the talents of women in the workplace. In banks, factories, schools etc. And such a society will be more civilized and prosperous. Self-reliance. A nation can promote economic growth and modernization by using its own resources or by using resources imported from other nations. The first 7 5-year plans gave importance to self-reliance, which means avoiding imports of those goods which could be produced in India itself. This policy was considered a necessity in order to reduce our dependence on foreign countries, especially for food. It is understandable that people who were recently freed from foreign domination should give importance to self-reliance. Further, it was feared that dependence on imported food supplies, foreign technology, and foreign capital may make India's sovereignty vulnerable to foreign interference in our policies. Equity, now growth, modernization, and self-reliance, by themselves, may not improve the kind of life which people are living. A country can have high growth, the most modern technology developed in the country itself, and also have most of its people living in poverty. It is important to ensure that the benefits of economic prosperity reach the poor sections as well instead of being enjoyed only by the rich. So, in addition to growth, modernization, and self-reliance, equity is also important. Every Indian should be able to meet his or her basic needs such as food, a decent house, education, and health care, and inequality in the distribution of wealth should be reduced. Let us now see how the first 7 5-year plans, covering the period 1950 to 1990, attempted to attain these 4 goals and the extent to which they succeeded in doing so, with reference to agriculture, industry, and trade. You will study the policies and developmental issues taken up after 1991 in Chapter 3. 2.3 Agriculture. You have learned in Chapter 1 that during the colonial rule there was neither growth nor equity in the agricultural sector. The policy makers of independent India had to address these issues, which they did through land reforms and promoting the use of miracle seeds, which ushered in a revolution in Indian agriculture. Land reforms. At the time of independence, the land tenure system was characterized by intermediaries, variously called zamindars, jagirdars etc., who merely collected rent from the actual tillers of the soil without contributing towards improvements on the farm. The low productivity of the agricultural sector forced India to import food from the United States of America, U.S.A. Equity in agriculture called for land reforms which primarily refer to change in the ownership of land holdings. Just a year after independence, steps were taken to abolish intermediaries and to make the tillers the owners of land. The idea behind this move was that ownership of land would give incentives to the tillers to invest in making improvements provided sufficient capital was made available to them. Land ceiling was another policy to promote equity in the agricultural sector. This means fixing the maximum size of land which could be owned by an individual. The purpose of land ceiling was to reduce the concentration of land ownership in a few hands. The abolition of intermediaries meant that some 200 lakh tenants came into direct contact with the government. They were thus freed from being exploited by the zamindars. The ownership conferred on tenants gave them the incentive to increase output, and this contributed to growth in agriculture. However, the goal of equity was not fully served by abolition of intermediaries. In some areas the former zamindars continued to own large areas of land by making use of some loopholes in the legislation. There were cases where tenants were evicted and the landowners claimed to be self-cultivators, the actual tillers, claiming ownership of the land, and even when the tillers got ownership of land, the poorest of the agricultural laborers, such as sharecroppers and landless laborers, did not benefit from land reforms. The land ceiling legislation also faced hurdles. The big landlords challenged the legislation in the courts, delaying its implementation. They used this delay to register their lands in the name of close relatives, thereby escaping from the legislation. The legislation also had a lot of loopholes which were exploited by the big landholders to retain their land. Land reforms were successful in Kerala and West Bengal because these states had governments committed to the policy of land to the tiller. Unfortunately, other states did not have the same level of commitment, and vast inequality in land holding continues to this day. The Green Revolution. At independence, about 75% of the country's population was dependent on agriculture. Productivity in the agricultural sector was very low because of the use of old technology and the absence of required infrastructure for the vast majority of farmers. India's agriculture vitally depends on the monsoon, and if the monsoon fell short, the farmers were in trouble unless they had access to irrigation facilities, which very few had. The stagnation in agriculture during the colonial rule was permanently broken by the Green Revolution. This refers to the large increase in production of food grains resulting from the use of high-yielding variety, HYV, seeds, especially for wheat and rice. The use of these seeds required the use of fertilizer and pesticide in the correct quantities as well as regular supply of water. The need for these inputs in correct proportions is vital. The farmers who could benefit from HYV seeds required reliable irrigation facilities as well as the financial resources to purchase fertilizer and pesticide. As a result, in the first phase of the Green Revolution, approximately mid-1960s up to mid-1970s, the use of HYV seeds was restricted to the more affluent states such as Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. Further, the use of HYV seeds primarily benefited the wheat-growing regions only. In the second phase of the Green Revolution, mid-1970s to mid-1980s, the HYV technology spread to a larger number of states and benefited more variety of crops. The spread of Green Revolution technology enabled India to achieve self-sufficiency in food grains. We no longer had to be at the mercy of America, or any other nation, for meeting our nation's food requirements. Growth in agricultural output is important, but it is not enough, if a large proportion of this increase is consumed by the farmers themselves instead of being sold in the market. The higher output will not make much of a difference to the economy as a whole. If, on the other hand, a substantial amount of agricultural produce is sold in the market by the farmers, the higher output can make a difference to the economy. The portion of agricultural produce which is sold in the market by the farmers is called marketed surplus. Fortunately, as pointed out by the famous economist C.H. Hanumantha Rao, a good proportion of the rice and wheat produced during the Green Revolution period, available as marketed surplus, was sold by the farmers in the market. As a result, the price of food grains declined relative to other items of consumption. The low-income groups, who spend a large percentage of their income on food, benefited from this decline in relative prices. The Green Revolution enabled the government to procure sufficient amount of food grains to build a stock which could be used in times of food shortage. While the nation had immensely benefited from the Green Revolution, the technology involved was not free from risks. One such risk was the possibility that it would increase the disparities between small and big farmers, since only the big farmers could afford the required inputs, thereby reaping most of the benefits of the Green Revolution. Moreover, the HYV crops were also more prone to attack by pests, and the small farmers who adopted this technology could lose everything in a pest attack. Fortunately, these fears did not come true because of the steps taken by the government. The government provided loans at a low interest rate to small farmers and subsidized fertilizers so that small farmers could also have access to the needed inputs. Since the small farmers could obtain the required inputs, the output on small farms equaled the output on large farms in the course of time. As a result, the Green Revolution benefited the small as well as rich farmers. The risk of the small farmers being ruined when pests attacked their crops was considerably reduced by the services rendered by research institutes established by the government. You should note that the Green Revolution would have favored the rich farmers only if the state did not play an extensive role in ensuring that the small farmer also gains from the new technology. The debate over subsidies, the economic justification of subsidies in agriculture is, at present, a hotly debated question. It is generally agreed that it was necessary to use subsidies to provide an incentive for adoption of the new HYV technology by farmers in general and small farmers in particular. Any new technology will be looked upon as being risky by farmers. Subsidies were, therefore, needed to encourage farmers to test the new technology. Some economists believe that once the technology is found profitable and is widely adopted, subsidies should be phased out since their purpose has been served. Further, subsidies are meant to benefit the farmers, but a substantial amount of fertilizer subsidy also benefits the fertilizer industry, and among farmers, the subsidy largely benefits the farmers in the more prosperous regions. Therefore, it is argued that there is no case for continuing with fertilizer subsidies. It does not benefit the target group and it is a huge burden on the government's finances. On the other hand, some believe that the government should continue with agricultural subsidies because farming in India continues to be a risky business. Most farmers are very poor and they will not be able to afford the required inputs without subsidies. Eliminating subsidies will increase the inequality between rich and poor farmers and violate the goal of equity. These experts argue that if subsidies are largely benefiting the fertilizer industry and big farmers, the correct policy is not to abolish subsidies but to take steps to ensure that only the poor farmers enjoy the benefits. Thus, by the late 1960s, Indian agricultural productivity had increased sufficiently to enable the country to be self-sufficient in food grains. This is an achievement to be proud of. On the negative side, some 65% of the country's population continued to be employed in agriculture even as late as 1990. Economists have found that as a nation becomes more prosperous, the proportion of GDP contributed by agriculture as well as the proportion of population working in the sector declines considerably. In India, between 1950 and 1990, the proportion of GDP contributed by agriculture declined significantly but not the population depending on it, 67.5% in 1950 to 64.9% by 1990. Why was such a large proportion of the population engaged in agriculture although agricultural output could have grown with much less people working in the sector? The answer is that the industrial sector and the service sector did not absorb the people working in the agricultural sector. Many economists call this an important failure of our policies followed during 1950 to 1990. 2.4 Industry and Trade. Economists have found that poor nations can progress only if they have a good industrial sector. Industry provides employment which is more stable than the employment in agriculture, it promotes modernization and overall prosperity. It is for this reason that the 5-year plans place a lot of emphasis on industrial development. You might have studied in the previous chapter that, at the time of independence, the variety of industries was very narrow, largely confined to cotton textiles and jute. There were 2 well-managed iron and steel firms, one in Jamshedpur and the other in Kolkata, but, obviously, we needed to expand the industrial base with a variety of industries if the economy was to grow. Market and state in Indian industrial development, the big question facing the policy makers was: what should be the role of the government and the private sector in industrial development? At the time of independence, Indian industrialists did not have the capital to undertake investment in industrial ventures required for the development of our economy, nor was the market big enough to encourage industrialists to undertake major projects even if they had the capital to do so. It is principally for these reasons that the state had to play an extensive role in promoting the industrial sector. In addition, the decision to develop the Indian economy on socialist lines led to the policy of the state controlling the commanding heights of the economy, as the second 5-year plan put it. This meant that the state would have complete control of those industries that were vital for the economy. The policies of the private sector would have to be complementary to those of the public sector, with the public sector leading the way. Industrial Policy Resolution 1956, IPR 1956. In accordance with the goal of the state controlling the commanding heights of the economy, the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956 was adopted. This resolution formed the basis of the second five-year plan, the plan which tried to build the basis for a socialist pattern of society. This resolution classified industries into three categories. The first category comprised industries which would be exclusively owned by the state. The second category consisted of industries in which the private sector could supplement the efforts of the state sector, with the state taking the sole responsibility for starting new units. The third category consisted of the remaining industries which were to be in the private sector. Although there was a category of industries left to the private sector, the sector was kept under state control through a system of licenses. No new industry was allowed unless a license was obtained from the government. This policy was used for promoting industry in backward regions. It was easier to obtain a license if the industrial unit was established in an economically backward area. In addition, such units were given certain concessions such as tax benefits and electricity at a lower tariff. The purpose of this policy was to promote regional equality. Even an existing industry had to obtain a license for expanding output or for diversifying production, producing a new variety of goods. This was meant to ensure that the quantity of goods produced was not more than what the economy required. License to expand production was given only if the government was convinced that the economy required the larger quantity of goods. Small-scale industry. In 1955, the Village and Small-Scale Industries Committee, also called the CARV Committee, noted the possibility of using small-scale industries for promoting rural development. A small-scale industry is defined with reference to the maximum investment allowed on the assets of a unit. This limit has changed over a period of time. In 1950, a small-scale industrial unit was one which invested a maximum of Rs 5 lakh. At present the maximum investment allowed is Rs 1 crore. It was believed that small-scale industries are more labor-intensive i.e. they use more labor than the large-scale industries and, therefore, generate more employment. But these industries cannot compete with the big industrial firms. It is obvious that development of small-scale industry requires them to be shielded from the large firms. For this purpose, the production of a number of products was reserved for the small-scale industry, the criterion of reservation being the ability of these units to manufacture the goods. They were also given concessions such as lower excise duty and bank loans at lower interest rates. 2.5 Trade Policy, Import Substitution. The industrial policy that we adopted was closely related to the trade policy. In the first 7 plans, trade was characterized by what is commonly called an inward-looking trade strategy. Technically, this strategy is called import substitution. This policy aimed at replacing or substituting imports with domestic production. For example, instead of importing vehicles made in a foreign country, industries would be encouraged to produce them in India itself. In this policy, the government protected the domestic industries from foreign competition. Protection from imports took 2 forms: tariffs and quotas. Tariffs are a tax on imported goods. They make imported goods more expensive and discourage their use. Quotas specify the quantity of goods which can be imported. The effect of tariffs and quotas is that they restrict imports and, therefore, protect the domestic firms from foreign competition. The policy of protection is based on the notion that industries of developing countries are not in a position to compete against the goods produced by more developed economies. It is assumed that if the domestic industries are protected, they will learn to compete in the course of time. Our planners also feared the possibility of foreign exchange being spent on import of luxury goods if no restrictions were placed on imports. Nor was any serious thought given to promote exports until the mid-1980s. Effect of policies on industrial development. The achievements of India's industrial sector during the first 7 plans are impressive indeed. The proportion of GDP contributed by the industrial sector increased in the period from 11.8% in 1950-51 to 24.6% in 1990-91. The rise in the industry's share of GDP is an important indicator of development. The 6% annual growth rate of the industrial sector during the period is commendable. No longer was Indian industry restricted largely to cotton textiles and jute. In fact, the industrial sector became well diversified by 1990, largely due to the public sector. The promotion of small-scale industries gave opportunities to those people who did not have the capital to start large firms to get into business. Protection from foreign competition enabled the development of indigenous industries in the areas of electronics and automobile sectors which otherwise could not have developed. In spite of the contribution made by the public sector to the growth of the Indian economy, some economists are critical of the performance of many public sector enterprises. It was proposed at the beginning of this chapter that initially public sector was required in a big way. It is now widely held that state enterprises continued to produce certain goods and services, often monopolizing them, although this was no longer required. An example is the provision of telecommunication service. The government had the monopoly of this service even after private sector firms could also provide it. Due to the absence of competition, even till the late 1990s, one had to wait for a long time to get a telephone connection. Another instance could be the establishment of Modern Bread, a bread manufacturing firm, as if the private sector could not manufacture bread. In 2001 this firm was sold to the private sector. The point is that no distinction was made between 1. What the public sector alone can do and 2. What the private sector can also do. For example, even now only the public sector can supply national defense and free medical treatment for poor patients. And even though the private sector can manage hotels well, yet, the government also runs hotels. This has led some scholars to argue that the state should get out of areas which the private sector can manage and the government may concentrate its resources on important services which the private sector cannot provide. Many public sector firms incurred huge losses but continued to function because it is very difficult, almost impossible, to close a government undertaking even if it is a drain on the nation's limited resources. This does not mean that private firms are always profitable. Indeed, quite a few of the public sector firms were originally private firms which were on the verge of closure due to losses. They were then nationalized to protect the jobs of the workers. However, a loss-making private firm will not waste resources by being kept running despite the losses. The need to obtain a license to start an industry was misused by industrial houses. A big industrialist would get a license not for starting a new firm but to prevent competitors from starting new firms. The excessive regulation of what came to be called the permit license Raj prevented certain firms from becoming more efficient. More time was spent by industrialists in trying to obtain a license or lobby with the concerned ministries rather than on thinking about how to improve their products. The protection from foreign competition is also being criticized on the ground that it continued even after it proved to do more harm than good. Due to restrictions on imports, the Indian consumers had to purchase whatever the Indian producers produced. The producers were aware that they had a captive market, so they had no incentive to improve the quality of their goods. Why should they think of improving quality when they could sell low-quality items at a high price? Competition from imports forces our producers to be more efficient. Nevertheless, scholars point out that the public sector is not meant for earning profits but to promote the welfare of the nation. The public sector firms, on this view, should be evaluated on the basis of the extent to which they contribute to the welfare of people and not on the profits they earn. Regarding protection, some economists hold that we should protect our producers from foreign competition as long as the rich nations continue to do so. Owing to all these conflicts, economists called for a change in our policy. This, along with other problems, led the government to introduce a new economic policy in 1991. 2.6 Conclusion. The progress of the Indian economy during the first 7 plans was impressive indeed. Our industries became far more diversified compared to the situation at independence. India became self-sufficient in food production thanks to the Green Revolution. Land reforms resulted in abolition of the hated zamindari system. However, many economists became dissatisfied with the performance of many public sector enterprises. Excessive government regulation prevented growth of entrepreneurship. In the name of self-reliance, our producers were protected against foreign competition, and this did not give them the incentive to improve the quality of goods that they produced. Our policies were inward-oriented, and so we failed to develop a strong export sector. The need for reform of economic policy was widely felt in the context of changing global economic scenario, and the new economic policy was initiated in 1991 to make our economy more efficient. This is the subject of the next chapter. Recap. After independence, India envisaged an economic system which combines the best features of socialism and capitalism. This culminated in the mixed economy model. All the economic planning has been formulated through 5-year plans. Common goals of 5-year plans are growth, modernization, self-sufficiency, and equity. The major policy initiatives in agriculture sector were land reforms and Green Revolution. These initiatives helped India to become self-sufficient in food grains production. The proportion of people depending on agriculture did not decline as expected. Policy initiatives in the industrial sector raised its contribution to GDP. One of the major drawbacks in the industrial sector was the inefficient functioning of the public sector, as it started incurring losses leading to drain on the nation's limited resources. Box 2.1 Types of economic systems. Every society has to answer 3 questions. What goods and services should be produced in the country? How should the goods and services be produced? Should producers use more human labor or more capital, machines, for producing things? How should the goods and services be distributed among people? One answer to these questions is to depend on the market forces of supply and demand. In a market economy, also called capitalism, only those consumer goods will be produced that are in demand, i.e., goods that can be sold profitably either in the domestic or in the foreign markets. If cars are in demand, cars will be produced, and if bicycles are in demand, bicycles will be produced. If labor is cheaper than capital, more labor-intensive methods of production will be used, and vice versa. In a capitalist society, the goods produced are distributed among people not on the basis of what people need but on the basis of what people can afford and are willing to purchase. This means that a sick person will be able to use the required medicine only if he/she can afford to buy it. If they cannot afford the medicine, they will not be able to use it even if they need it urgently. Such a society did not appeal to Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, for it meant that the great majority of people of the country would be left behind without the chance to improve their quality of life. A socialist society answers the 3 questions in a totally different manner. In a socialist society, the government decides what goods are to be produced in accordance with the needs of society. It is assumed that the government knows what is good for the people of the country, and so the desires of individual consumers are not given much importance. The government decides how goods are to be produced and how they should be distributed. In principle, distribution under socialism is supposed to be based on what people need and not on what they can afford to purchase. Unlike under capitalism, for example, a socialist nation provides free healthcare to the citizens who need it. Strictly, a socialist society has no private property since everything is owned by the state. With the collapse of the Soviet system in the last decades of the 20th century, socialist economies in the former Soviet Union and the socialist states in Eastern Europe ceased to exist. Most economies are mixed economies, i.e., the government and the market together answer the three questions of what to produce, how to produce and how to distribute what is produced. In a mixed economy, the market will provide whatever goods and services it can produce well, and the government will provide essential goods and services which the market fails to do. Box 2.3, Mahalanobis, the architect of Indian planning. Many distinguished thinkers contributed to the formulation of our 5-year plans. Among them, the name of the statistician, Prasanth Chandra Mahalanobis, stands out. Planning, in the real sense of the term, began with the second 5-year plan. The second plan, a landmark contribution to development planning in general, laid down the basic ideas regarding goals of Indian planning. This plan was based on the ideas of Mahalanobis. In that sense, he can be regarded as the architect of Indian planning. Mahalanobis was born in 1893 in Calcutta. He was educated at the Presidency College in Calcutta and at Cambridge University in England. His contributions to the subject of statistics brought him international fame. In 1946 he was made a Fellow, member, of Britain's Royal Society, one of the most prestigious organizations of scientists. Only the most outstanding scientists are made members of this society. Mahalanobis established the Indian Statistical Institute, ISI, in Calcutta and started a journal, Sankhya, which still serves as a respected forum for statisticians to discuss their ideas. Both, the ISI and Sankhya, are highly regarded by statisticians and economists all over the world to this day. During the second plan period, Mahalanobis invited many distinguished economists from India and abroad to advise him on India's economic development. Some of these economists became Nobel Prize winners later, which shows that he could identify individuals with talent. Among the economists invited by Mahalanobis were those who were very critical of the socialist principles of the second plan. In other words, he was willing to listen to what his critics had to say, the mark of a great scholar. Many economists today reject the approach to planning formulated by Mahalanobis, but he will always be remembered for playing a vital role in putting India on the road to economic progress, and statisticians continue to profit from his contribution to statistical theory. Box 2.4, the service sector. As a country develops, it undergoes structural change. In the case of India, the structural change is peculiar. Usually, with development, the share of agriculture declines and the share of industry becomes dominant. At higher levels of development, the service sector contributes more to the GDP than the other two sectors. In India, the share of agriculture in the GDP was more than 50%, as we would expect for a poor country. But by 1990 the share of the service sector was 40.59%, more than that of agriculture or industry, like what we find in developed nations. This phenomenon of growing share of the service sector was accelerated in the post-1991 period. This marked the onset of globalization in the country, which will be discussed in a subsequent chapter. Box 2.5, Ownership and Incentives. The policy of land to the tiller is based on the idea that the cultivators will take more interest, they will have more incentive in increasing output if they are the owners of the land. This is because ownership of land enables the tiller to make profit from the increased output. Tenants do not have the incentive to make improvements on land, since it is the landowner who would benefit more from higher output. The importance of ownership in providing incentives is well illustrated by the carelessness with which farmers in the former Soviet Union used to pack fruits for sale. It was not uncommon to see farmers packing rotten fruits along with fresh fruits in the same box. Now, every farmer knows that the rotten fruits will spoil the fresh fruits if they are packed together. This will be a loss to the farmers since the fruits cannot be sold. So why did the Soviet farmers do something which would so obviously result in loss for them? The answer lies in the incentives facing the farmers. Since farmers in the former Soviet Union did not own any land, they neither enjoyed the profits nor suffered the losses. In the absence of ownership, there was no incentive on the part of farmers to be efficient, which also explains the poor performance of the agricultural sector in the Soviet Union despite availability of vast areas of highly fertile land. Box 2.2 What is a plan? A plan spells out how the resources of a nation should be put to use. It should have some general goals as well as specific objectives which are to be achieved within a specified period of time. In India, plans are of 5 years duration and are called 5-year plans. We borrowed this from the former Soviet Union, the pioneer in national planning. Our plan documents not only specify the objectives to be attained in the 5 years of a plan but also what is to be achieved over a period of 20 years. This long-term plan is called Perspective Plan. The 5-year plans are supposed to provide the basis for the perspective plan. It will be unrealistic to expect all the goals of a plan to be given equal importance in all the plans. In fact, the goals may actually be in conflict. For example, the goal of introducing modern technology may be in conflict with the goal of increasing employment if the technology reduces the need for labor. The planners have to balance the goals, a very difficult job indeed. We find different goals being emphasized in different plans in India. Our 5-year plans do not spell out how much of each and every good and service is to be produced. This is neither possible nor necessary. The former Soviet Union tried to do this and failed. It is enough if the plan is specific about the sectors where it plays a commanding role, for instance, power generation and irrigation, while leaving the rest to the market. Box 2.6 Prices as signals. You would have learned in an earlier class about how prices of goods are determined in the market. It is important to understand that prices are signals about the availability of goods. If a good becomes scarce, its price will rise and those who use this good will have the incentive to make efficient decisions about its use based on the price. If the price of water goes up because of lower supply, people will have the incentive to use it with greater care. For example, they may stop watering the garden to conserve water. We complain whenever the price of petrol increases and blame it on the government. But the increase in petrol price reflects greater scarcity and the price rise is a signal that less petrol is available. This provides an incentive to use less petrol or look for alternate fuels. Some economists point out that subsidies do not allow prices to indicate the supply of a good. When electricity and water are provided at a subsidized rate or free, they will be used wastefully without any concern for their scarcity. Farmers will cultivate water-intensive crops if water is supplied free, although the water resources in that region may be scarce and such crops will further deplete the already scarce resources. If water is priced to reflect scarcity, farmers will cultivate crops suitable to the region. Fertilizer and pesticide subsidies result in overuse of resources which can be harmful to the environment. Subsidies provide an incentive for wasteful use of resources. Think about subsidies in terms of incentives and ask yourself whether it is wise from the economic viewpoint to provide free electricity to farmers. Unit 2. Economic reforms. Since 1991. After 40 years of planned development, India has been able to achieve a strong industrial base and became self-sufficient in the production of food grains. Nevertheless, a major segment of the population continues to depend on agriculture for its livelihood. In 1991, a crisis in the balance of payments led to the introduction of economic reforms in the country. This unit is an appraisal of the reform process and its implications for India. 3. Liberalization, privatization, and globalization, An appraisal. After studying this chapter, the learners will understand the background of the reform policies introduced in India in 1991. Understand the mechanism through which reform policies were introduced. Comprehend the process of globalization and its implications for India. Be aware of the impact of the reform process in various sectors. There is a consensus in the world today that economic development is not all and the GDP is not necessarily a measure of progress of a society. K. R. Narayanan. 3.1 Introduction. You have studied in the previous chapter that, since independence, India followed the mixed economy framework by combining the advantages of the market economic system with those of the planned economic system. Some scholars argue that, over the years, this policy resulted in the establishment of a variety of rules and laws which were aimed at controlling and regulating the economy and instead ended up hampering the process of growth and development. Others state that India, which started its developmental path from near stagnation, has since been able to achieve growth in savings, developed a diversified industrial sector which produces a variety of goods and has experienced sustained expansion of agricultural output which has ensured food security. In 1991, India met with an economic crisis relating to its external debt. The government was not able to make repayments on its borrowings from abroad. Foreign exchange reserves, which we generally maintain to import petrol and other important items, dropped to levels that were not sufficient for even a fortnight. The crisis was further compounded by rising prices of essential goods. All these led the government to introduce a new set of policy measures which changed the direction of our developmental strategies. In this chapter, we will look at the background of the crisis, measures that the government has adopted and their impact on various sectors of the economy. 3.2 Background. The origin of the financial crisis can be traced from the inefficient management of the Indian economy in the 1980s. We know that for implementing various policies and its general administration, the government generates funds from various sources such as taxation, running of public sector enterprises etc. When expenditure is more than income, the government borrows to finance the deficit from banks and also from people within the country and from international financial institutions. When we import goods like petroleum, we pay in dollars which we earn from our exports. Development policies required that even though the revenues were very low, the government had to overshoot its revenue to meet problems like unemployment, poverty, and population explosion. The continued spending on development programs of the government did not generate additional revenue. Moreover, the government was not able to generate sufficiently from internal sources such as taxation. When the government was spending a large share of its income on areas which do not provide immediate returns such as the social sector and defense, there was a need to utilize the rest of its revenue in a highly efficient manner. The income from public sector undertakings was also not very high to meet the growing expenditure. At times, our foreign exchange, borrowed from other countries and international financial institutions, was spent on meeting consumption needs. Neither was an attempt made to reduce such profligate spending nor sufficient attention was given to boost exports to pay for the growing imports. In the late 1980s, government expenditure began to exceed its revenue by such large margins that it became unsustainable. Prices of many essential goods rose sharply. Imports grew at a very high rate without matching growth of exports. As pointed out earlier, foreign exchange reserves declined to a level that was not adequate to finance imports for more than 2 weeks. There was also not sufficient foreign exchange to pay the interest that needs to be paid to international lenders. India approached the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, popularly known as World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and received $7 billion as loan to manage the crisis. For availing the loan, these international agencies expected India to liberalize and open up the economy by removing restrictions on the private sector, reduce the role of the government in many areas and remove trade restrictions. India agreed to the conditionalities of World Bank and IMF and announced the new economic policy, NEP. The NEP consisted of wide-ranging economic reforms. The thrust of the policies was towards creating a more competitive environment in the economy and removing the barriers to entry and growth of firms. This set of policies can broadly be classified into two groups: the stabilization measures and the structural reform measures. Stabilization measures are short-term measures, intended to correct some of the weaknesses that have developed in the balance of payments and to bring inflation under control. In simple words, this means that there was a need to maintain sufficient foreign exchange reserves and keep the rising prices under control. On the other hand, structural reform policies are long-term measures, aimed at improving the efficiency of the economy and increasing its international competitiveness by removing the rigidities in various segments of the Indian economy. The government initiated a variety of policies which fall under three heads, viz. Liberalization, privatization, and globalization. The first two are policy strategies and the last one is the outcome of these strategies. 3.3 Liberalization. As pointed out in the beginning, rules and laws which were aimed at regulating the economic activities became major hindrances in growth and development. Liberalization was introduced to put an end to these restrictions and open up various sectors of the economy. Though a few liberalization measures were introduced in 1980s in areas of industrial licensing, export-import policy, technology upgradation, fiscal policy and foreign investment, reform policies initiated in 1991 were more comprehensive. Let us study some important areas such as the industrial sector, financial sector, tax reforms, foreign exchange markets and trade and investment sectors which received greater attention in and after 1991. Deregulation of industrial sector. In India, regulatory mechanisms were enforced in various ways. 1. Industrial licensing, under which every entrepreneur had to get permission from government officials to start a firm, close a firm or to decide the amount of goods that could be produced. 2. Private sector was not allowed in many industries. 3. Some goods could be produced only in small-scale industries and 4. Controls on price fixation and distribution of selected industrial products. The reform policies introduced in and after 1991 removed many of these restrictions. Industrial licensing was abolished for almost all but product categories: alcohol, cigarettes, hazardous chemicals, industrial explosives, electronics, aerospace, and drugs and pharmaceuticals. The only industries which are now reserved for the public sector are defense equipments, atomic energy generation and railway transport. Many goods produced by small-scale industries have now been dear-served. In many industries, the market has been allowed to determine the prices. Financial sector reforms. Financial sector includes financial institutions such as commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange operations and foreign exchange market. The financial sector in India is controlled by the Reserve Bank of India, RBI. You may be aware that all the banks and other financial institutions in India are controlled through various norms and regulations of the RBI. The RBI decides the amount of money that the banks can keep with themselves, fixes interest rates, nature of lending to various sectors etc. One of the major aims of financial sector reforms is to reduce the role of RBI from regulator to facilitator of financial sector. This means that the financial sector may be allowed to take decisions on many matters without consulting the RBI. The reform policies led to the establishment of private sector banks, Indian as well as foreign. Foreign investment limit in banks was raised to around 50%. Those banks which fulfill certain conditions have been given freedom to set up new branches without the approval of the RBI and rationalize their existing branch networks. Though banks have been given permission to generate resources from India and abroad, certain aspects have been retained with the RBI to safeguard the interests of the account holders and the nation. Foreign institutional investors, FII, such as merchant bankers, mutual funds, and pension funds are now allowed to invest in Indian financial markets. Tax reforms. Tax reforms are concerned with the reforms in government's taxation and public expenditure policies, which are collectively known as its fiscal policy. There are two types of taxes, direct and indirect. Direct taxes consist of taxes on incomes of individuals as well as profits of business enterprises. Since 1991, there has been a continuous reduction in the taxes on individual incomes, as it was felt that high rates of income tax were an important reason for tax evasion. It is now widely accepted that moderate rates of income tax encourage savings and voluntary disclosure of income. The rate of corporation tax, which was very high earlier, has been gradually reduced. Efforts have also been made to reform the indirect taxes, taxes levied on commodities, in order to facilitate the establishment of a common national market for goods and commodities. Another component of reforms in this area is simplification. In order to encourage better compliance on the part of taxpayers, many procedures have been simplified and the rates also substantially lowered. Foreign exchange reforms. The first important reform in the external sector was made in the foreign exchange market. In 1991, as an immediate measure to resolve the balance of payments crisis, the rupee was devalued against foreign currencies. This led to an increase in the inflow of foreign exchange. It also set the tone to free the determination of rupee value in the foreign exchange market from government control. Now, more often than not, markets determine exchange rates based on the demand and supply of foreign exchange. Trade and investment policy reforms. Liberalization of trade and investment regime was initiated to increase international competitiveness of industrial production and also foreign investments and technology into the economy. The aim was also to promote the efficiency of the local industries and the adoption of modern technologies. In order to protect domestic industries, India was following a regime of quantitative restrictions on imports. This was encouraged through tight control over imports and by keeping the tariffs very high. These policies reduced efficiency and competitiveness, which led to slow growth of the manufacturing sector. The trade policy reforms aimed at 1. Dismantling of quantitative restrictions on imports and exports, 2. Reduction of tariff rates, and 3. Removal of licensing procedures for imports. Import licensing was abolished except in case of hazardous and environmentally sensitive industries. Quantitative restrictions on imports of manufactured consumer goods and agricultural products were also fully removed from April 2001. Export duties have been removed to increase the competitive position of Indian goods in the international markets. 3.4 Privatization. It implies shedding of the ownership or management of a government-owned enterprise. Government companies can be converted into private companies in two ways: 1. By withdrawal of the government from ownership and management of public sector companies, and or 2. By outright sale of public sector companies. Privatization of the public sector undertakings by selling off part of the equity of PSUs to the public is known as disinvestment. The purpose of the sale, according to the government, was mainly to improve financial discipline and facilitate modernization. It was also envisaged that private capital and managerial capabilities could be effectively utilized to improve the performance of the PSUs. The government envisaged that privatization could provide strong impetus to the inflow of FDI. The government has also made attempts to improve the efficiency of PSUs by giving them autonomy in taking managerial decisions. For instance, some PSUs have been granted special status as Navaratnas and Mini Ratnas. 3.5 Globalization. Globalization is the outcome of the policies of liberalization and privatization. Although globalization is generally understood to mean integration of the economy of the country with the world economy, it is a complex phenomenon. It is an outcome of the set of various policies that are aimed at transforming the world towards greater interdependence and integration. It involves creation of networks and activities transcending economic, social, and geographical boundaries. Globalization attempts to establish links in such a way that the happenings in India can be influenced by events happening miles away. It is turning the world into one whole or creating a borderless world. Outsourcing. This is one of the important outcomes of the globalization process. In outsourcing, a company hires regular service from external sources, mostly from other countries, which was previously provided internally or from within the country, like legal advice, computer service, advertisement, security, each provided by respective departments of the company. As a form of economic activity, outsourcing has intensified, in recent times, because of the growth of fast modes of communication, particularly the growth of information technology, IT. Many of the services such as voice-based business processes, popularly known as BPO or call centers, record keeping, accountancy, banking services, music recording, film editing, book transcription, clinical advice or even teaching are being outsourced by companies in developed countries to India. With the help of modern telecommunication links including the Internet, the text, voice, and visual data in respect of these services is digitized and transmitted in real time over continents and national boundaries. Most multinational corporations, and even small companies, are outsourcing their services to India where they can be availed at a cheaper cost with reasonable degree of skill and accuracy. The low wage rates and availability of skilled manpower in India have made it a destination for global outsourcing in the post-reform period. World Trade Organization, WTO. The WTO was founded in 1995 as the successor organization to the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, GATT. GATT was established in 1948 with 23 countries as the Global Trade Organization to administer all multilateral trade agreements by providing equal opportunities to all countries in the international market for trading purposes. WTO is expected to establish a rule-based trading regime in which nations cannot place arbitrary restrictions on trade. In addition, its purpose is also to enlarge production and trade of services, to ensure optimum utilization of world resources and to protect the environment. The WTO agreements cover trade in goods as well as services to facilitate international trade, bilateral and multilateral, through removal of tariff as well as non-tariff barriers and providing greater market access to all member countries. As an important member of WTO, India has been in the forefront of framing fair global rules, regulations, and safeguards and advocating the interests of the developing world. India has kept its commitments towards liberalization of trade, made in the WTO, by removing quantitative restrictions on imports and reducing tariff rates. Some scholars question the usefulness of India being a member of the WTO, as a major volume of international trade occurs among the developed nations. They also say that while developed countries file complaints over agricultural subsidies given in their countries, developing countries feel cheated as they are forced to open up their markets for developed countries but are not allowed access to the markets of developed countries. What do you think? 3.6 Indian economy during reforms. An assessment. The reform process has completed 1.5 decades since its introduction. Let us now look at the performance of the Indian economy during this period. In economics, growth of an economy is measured by the gross domestic product. Look at Table 3.1. The table shows The growth of GDP in different periods. The growth of GDP increased from 5.6% during 1980-91 to 6.4% during 1992-2001. This shows that there has been an increase in the overall GDP growth in the reform period. During the reform period, the growth of agriculture and industrial sectors has declined, whereas the growth of service sector has gone up. This indicates that the growth is mainly driven by the growth in the service sector. The 10th Plan, 2002-07 has projected the GDP growth rate at 8%. In order to achieve such a high growth rate, the agriculture, industrial, and service sectors have to grow at the rates of 4, 9.5 and 9.1 percentage points respectively. However, some scholars raise apprehensions over the projection of such high rates of growth as unsustainable. The opening up of the economy has led to rapid increase in foreign direct investment and foreign exchange reserves. The foreign investment, which includes foreign direct investment and foreign institutional investment, has increased from about US $100 million in 1990-91 to US $150 billion in 2003-04. There has been an increase in the foreign exchange reserves from about US $6 billion in 1990-91 to US $125 billion in 2004-05. At present, India is the sixth largest foreign exchange reserve holder in the world. India is seen as a successful exporter of auto parts, engineering goods, IT software, and textiles in the reform period. Rising prices have also been kept under control. On the other hand, the reform process has been widely criticized for not being able to address some of the basic problems facing our economy, especially in the areas of employment, agriculture, industry, infrastructure development, and fiscal management. Growth and employment. Though the GDP growth rate has increased in the reform period, scholars point out that the reformist growth has not generated sufficient employment opportunities in the country. You will study the link between different aspects of employment and growth in the next unit. Work these out. In the previous chapter, you might have studied about subsidies in various sectors including agriculture. Some scholars argue that subsidy in agriculture should be removed to make the sector internationally competitive. Do you agree? If so, how can it be done? Discuss in class. Read the following passage and discuss in class. Groundnut is a major oil seed crop in Andhra Pradesh. Mahadeva, who was a farmer in Anandpur district of Andhra Pradesh, used to spend Rs 1,500 for growing groundnut on his plot of half an acre. The cost included expenditure on raw materials, seeds, fertilizers etc., labor, bullock power, and machinery used. On an average, Mahadeva used to get 2 quintals of groundnut, and each quintal was sold for Rs 1,000. Mahadeva, thus, was spending Rs 1,500 and getting an income of Rs 2,000. Anandpur district is a drought-prone area. As a result of economic reforms, the government did not undertake any major irrigation project. Recently, groundnut crop in Anandpur is facing problems due to crop disease. Research and extension work has gone down due to lower government expenditure. Mahadeva and his friends brought this matter repeatedly to the notice of the concerned authorities, but failed. Subsidy was reduced on materials, seeds, fertilizers, which increased Mahadeva's cost of cultivation. Moreover, the local markets were flooded with cheap imported edible oils, which was a result of removal of restriction on imports. Mahadeva was not able to sell his groundnut in the market as he was not getting the price to cover his cost. Is a farmer like Mahadeva better off after reforms? Discuss in the class. Reforms in agriculture. reforms have not been able to benefit agriculture, where the growth rate has been decelerating. Public investment in agriculture sector, especially in infrastructure, which includes irrigation, power, roads, market linkages, and research and extension, which played a crucial role in the Green Revolution, has been reduced in the reform period. Further, the removal of fertilizer subsidy has led to increase in the cost of production, which has severely affected the small and marginal farmers. Moreover, since the commencement of WTO, this sector has been experiencing a number of policy changes such as reduction in import duties on agricultural products, removal of minimum support price and lifting of quantitative restrictions on agricultural products. These have adversely affected Indian farmers as they now have to face increased international competition. Moreover, because of export-oriented policy strategies in agriculture, there has been a shift from production for the domestic market towards production for the export market, focusing on cash crops in lieu of production of food grains. This puts pressure on prices of food grains. This is because of decreasing demand of industrial products due to various reasons such as cheaper imports, inadequate investment in infrastructure etc. In a globalized world, developing countries are compelled to open up their economies to greater flow of goods and capital from developed countries and rendering their industries vulnerable to imported goods. Cheaper imports have, thus, replaced the demand for domestic goods. Domestic manufacturers are facing competition from imports. The infrastructure facilities, including power supply, have remained inadequate due to lack of investment. Globalization is, thus, often seen as creating conditions for the free movement of goods and services from foreign countries that adversely affect the local industries and employment opportunities in developing countries. Moreover, a developing country like India still does not have the access to developed countries' markets because of high non-tariff barriers. For example, although all quota restrictions on exports of textiles and clothing have been removed from our side, U.S. has not removed their quota restriction on import of textiles from India and China. Reforms in industry, industrial growth has also recorded a slowdown. Disinvestment, every year, the government fixes a target for disinvestment of PSUs. For instance, in 1991-92, it was targeted to mobilize Rs 2,500 crore through disinvestment. The government was able to mobilize Rs 3,040 crore more than the target. In 1998-99, the target was Rs 5,000 crore, whereas the achievement was Rs 5,400 crore. Critics point out that the assets of PSUs have been undervalued and sold to the private sector. This means that there has been a substantial loss to the government. Moreover, the proceeds from disinvestment were used to offset the shortage of government revenues rather than using it for the development of PSUs and building social infrastructure in the country. Reforms and fiscal policies. Economic reforms have placed limits on the growth of public expenditure, especially in social sectors. The tax reductions in the reform period, aimed at yielding larger revenue and to curb tax evasion, have not resulted in increase in tax revenue for the government. Also, the reform policies involving tariff reduction have curtailed the scope for raising revenue through customs duties. In order to attract foreign investment, tax incentives were provided to foreign investors, which further reduced the scope for raising tax revenues. This has a negative impact on developmental and welfare expenditures. 3.7 Conclusion. The process of globalization through liberalization and privatization policies has produced positive as well as negative results both for India and other countries. Some scholars argue that globalization should be seen as an opportunity in terms of greater access to global markets, high technology, and increased possibility of large industries of developing countries to become important players in the international arena. On the contrary, the critics argue that globalization is a strategy of the developed countries to expand their markets in other countries. According to them, it has compromised the welfare and identity of people belonging to poor countries. It has further been pointed out that market-driven globalization has widened the economic disparities among nations and people. Viewed from the Indian context, some studies have stated that the crisis that erupted in the early 1990s was basically an outcome of the deep-rooted inequalities in Indian society and the economic reform policies initiated as a response to the crisis by the government, with externally advised policy package, further aggravated the inequalities. Further, it has increased the income and quality of consumption of only high-income groups, and the growth has been concentrated only in some select areas in the services sector such as telecommunication, information technology, finance, entertainment, travel, and hospitality services, real estate and trade, rather than vital sectors such as agriculture and industry, which provide livelihoods to millions of people in the country. Recap: the economy was facing problems of declining foreign exchange, growing imports without matching rise in exports, and high inflation. India changed its economic policies in 1991 due to a financial crisis and pressure from international organizations like the World Bank and IMF. In the domestic economy, major reforms were undertaken in the industrial and financial sectors. Major external sector reforms included foreign exchange deregulations and import liberalization. With a view to improving the performance of the public sector, there was a consensus on reducing its role and opening it up to the private sector. This was done through disinvestment and liberalization measures. Globalization is the outcome of the policies of liberalization and privatization. It means an integration of the economy of the country with the world economy. Outsourcing is an emerging business activity. The objective of the WTO is to establish a rule-based trade regime to ensure optimum utilization of world resources. During the reforms, growth of agriculture and industry has gone down, but the service sector has registered growth. Reforms have not benefited the agriculture sector. There has also been a decline in public investment in this sector. Industrial sector growth has slowed down due to availability of cheaper imports and lower investment. Box 3.3, Sri-Sila tragedy. As a part of liberalization, privatization, and globalization, the government started to reform the power sector. The most important impact of these reforms has been a steep hike in power tariff. Since the power looms, on which a large number of industrial workers in cottage and small-scale sector depend, are driven by power energy, the impact of high tariff on them has been very serious. Further, while the power sector reforms have led to hike in tariffs, the power producers have failed in providing quality power to the power loom industry. Since the wages of the power loom workers are linked to the production of cloth, power cut means cut in wages of weavers who were already suffering from hike in tariff. This led to a crisis in the livelihood of the weavers, and 50 power loom workers committed suicide in a small town called Sri-Sila in Andhra Pradesh. Do you think the power tariff should not be raised? What would be your suggestions to improve the profitability of electricity producing companies? Box 3.1, Navaratnas and Public Enterprise Policies. You must have read in your childhood about the famous Navaratnas or 9 jewels in the imperial court of King Vikramaditya, who were eminent persons of excellence in the fields of art, literature, and knowledge. In 1996, in order to improve efficiency, infuse professionalism, and enable them to compete more effectively in the liberalist global environment, the government chose 9 PSUs and declared them as Navaratnas. They were given greater managerial and operational autonomy, in taking various decisions to run the company efficiently and thus increase their profits. Greater operational, financial, and managerial autonomy had also been granted to 97 other profit-making enterprises referred to as mini-ratnas. The first set of Navaratna companies included Indian Oil Corporation Ltd, IOC, Bharat Petroleum Corporation Ltd, BPCL, Hindustan Petroleum Corporation Ltd, HPCL, Oil and Natural Gas Corporation Ltd, ONGC, Steel Authority of India Ltd, SAIL, Indian Petrochemicals Corporation Ltd, IPCL, Bharat Heavy Electricals Ltd, BHEL, National Thermal Power Corporation, NTPC, and Videsh Sanchar Nigam Ltd, VSNL. Later, two more PSUs, Gas Authority of India Limited, GAIL, and Mahanagar Telephone Nigam Ltd, MTNL, were also given the same status. Many of these profitable PSUs were originally formed during the 1950s and 1960s when self-reliance was an important element of public policy. They were set up with the intention of providing infrastructure and direct employment to the public so that quality end product reaches the masses at a nominal cost, and the companies themselves were made accountable to all stakeholders. The granting of Navaratna status resulted in better performance of these companies. Scholars state that instead of facilitating Navaratnas in their expansion and enabling them to become global players, the government partly privatized them through disinvestment. Of late, the government has decided to retain the Navaratnas in the public sector and enable them to expand themselves in the global markets and raise resources by themselves from financial markets. Box 3.2, Global Footprint. Owing to globalization, you might find many Indian companies expanding their wings to many other countries. In 2000, Tata Tea surprised the world by acquiring the UK-based Tetley, the inventor of the tea bag, for Rs 1,870 crore. In the year 2004, Tata Steel bought the Singapore-based Nat Steel for Rs 1,245 crore, and Tata Motors completed the buyout of Daewoo's heavy commercial vehicle unit in South Korea for Rs 448 crore. Now VSNL is acquiring Tyco's undersea cable network for Rs 572 crore, which will control over 60,000 kilometers undersea cable network across 3 continents. The Tatas also plan to invest Rs 8,800 crore in fertilizer, steel, and power plants in Bangladesh. Work these out. Many scholars argue that globalization is a threat as it reduces the role of the state in many sectors. Some counter-argue that it is an opportunity as it opens up markets to compete in and capture. Debate in the classroom. Prepare a chart consisting of a list of 5 companies that have BPO services in India, along with their turnover. Read this excerpt of a news item from a daily newspaper describing something that is now becoming increasingly common. On a morning, a few minutes before 7 a.m., Grishma sat in front of her computer with her headset on and said in accented English, "Hello, Daniela." Seconds later, she gets the reply, "Hello, Grishma." The two chatted excitedly before Grishma said that we will work on pronouns today. Nothing unusual about this chat except that Grishma, 22, was in Kochi and her student Daniela, 13, was at her home in Malibu, California. Using a simulated whiteboard on their computers, connected by the internet, and a copy of Daniela's textbook in front of Grishma, she guides the teenager through the intricacies of nouns, adjectives, and verbs. Grishma, who grew up speaking Malayalam, was teaching Daniela English grammar, comprehension, and writing. How has this become possible? Why can't Daniela get lessons in her own country? Why is she getting English lessons from India, where English is not the mother tongue? India is benefiting from liberalization and integration of world markets. Do you agree? Is employment in call centers sustainable? What kinds of skills should people working in call centers acquire to get a regular income? If the multinational companies outsource many services to countries like India because of cheap manpower, what will happen to people living in the countries where the companies are located? Discuss. Unit 3. Current challenges facing the Indian economy. Some of the most challenging issues facing India today are poverty, development of rural India and building infrastructure. We are a billion-strong country today and our human capital is the biggest asset. It needs investment in health and education. We also need to understand the concept of employment and the need for creating more employment in our country. We will also look at the implications of development on our environment and call for sustainable development. There is a need to critically assess government initiatives in tackling all these issues, each of which has been taken up separately in this unit. 4. Poverty. After studying this chapter, the learners will understand the various attributes of poverty, comprehend the diverse dimensions relating to the concept of poverty, critically appreciate the way poverty is estimated, appreciate and be able to assess existing poverty alleviation programs. No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. Adam Smith. 4.1 Introduction. In previous chapters, you have studied the economic policies that India has taken in the last 5.5 decades and the outcome of these policies with relation to the various developmental indicators. Providing minimum basic needs to the people and reduction of poverty have been the major aims of independent India. The pattern of development that the successive 5-year plans envisaged laid emphasis on the upliftment of the poorest of the poor, Antyodaya, integrating the poor into the mainstream and achieving a minimum standard of living for all. While addressing the Constituent Assembly in 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru had said, "This achievement, independence, is but a step, an opening of opportunity, to the great triumphs and achievements that await us, the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity." However, we need to know where we stand today. Poverty is not only a challenge for India, as more than 1/5 of the world's poor live in India alone, but also for the world, where more than 260 million people are not able to meet their basic needs. Poverty has many faces, which have been changing from place to place and across time, and has been described in many ways. Most often, poverty is a situation that people want to escape. So poverty is a call to action for the poor and the wealthy alike, a call to change the world so that many more may have enough to eat, adequate shelter, access to education and health, protection from violence, and a voice in what happens in their communities. To know what helps to reduce poverty, what works and what does not, what changes over time, poverty has to be defined, measured, and studied and even experienced. As poverty has many dimensions, it has to be looked at through a variety of indicators: levels of income and consumption, social indicators, and indicators of vulnerability to risks and of socio-political access. 4.2 Who are the poor? You would have noticed that in all localities and neighborhoods, both in rural and urban areas, there are some of us who are poor and some who are rich. Read the story of Anu and Sudha. Their lives are examples of the two extremes. There are also people who belong to the many stages in between. Pushcart vendors, street cobblers, women who string flowers, rag pickers, vendors, and beggars are some examples of poor and vulnerable groups in urban areas. They possess few assets. They reside in kucha hutments with walls made of baked mud and roofs made of grass, thatch, bamboo, and wood. The poorest of them do not even have such dwellings. In rural areas many of them are landless. Even if some of them possess land, it is only dry or waste land. Many do not get to have even 2 meals a day. Starvation and hunger are the key features of the poorest households. The poor lack basic literacy and skills and hence have very limited economic opportunities. Poor people also face unstable employment. Malnutrition is alarmingly high among the poor. Ill health, disability, or serious illness makes them physically weak. They borrow from money lenders who charge high rates of interest that lead them into chronic indebtedness. The poor are highly vulnerable. They are not able to negotiate their legal wages from employers and are exploited. Most poor households have no access to electricity. Their primary cooking fuel is firewood and cow dung cake. A large section of poor people do not even have access to safe drinking water. There is evidence of extreme gender inequality in the participation of gainful employment, education, and in decision-making within the family. Poor women receive less care on their way to motherhood. Their children are less likely to survive or be born healthy. Scholars identify the poor on the basis of their occupation and ownership of assets. They state that the rural poor work mainly as landless agricultural laborers, cultivators with very small land holdings, landless laborers who are engaged in a variety of non-agricultural jobs, and tenant cultivators with small land holdings. The urban poor are largely the overflow of the rural poor who had migrated to urban areas in search of alternative employment and livelihood, laborers who do a variety of casual jobs, and the self-employed who sell a variety of things on roadsides and are engaged in various activities. Box 4.1, Anu and Sudha. Anu and Sudha were both born on the same day. Anu's mother and father were construction laborers and Sudha's father was a businessman and her mother a designer. Anu's mother worked by carrying headloads of bricks until she went into labor. She then went behind the tool shed on the construction site and delivered her baby alone. She fed her child and then wrapped her in an old sari, made a cradle with a gunny sack, put little Anu in it and hung it from a tree. She hurried back to work as she was afraid she would lose her job. She hoped that Anu would sleep until evening. Sudha was born in one of the best nursing homes in the city. She was thoroughly checked by doctors, she was bathed and dressed in clean soft clothes and placed in a crib next to her mother. Her mother fed her whenever she was hungry, hugged and kissed her and sang her to sleep. Her family and friends celebrated her arrival. Anu and Sudha had very different childhoods. Anu learned to look after herself at a very early age. She knew what hunger and deprivation were. She discovered how to pick food from the dustbin, how to keep warm during the winter, to find shelter in the monsoon, and how to play with a piece of string, stones, and twigs. Anu could not go to school as her parents were migrant workers who kept moving from city to city in search of work. Anu loved to dance. Whenever she heard music she would improvise. She was very beautiful and her movements were graceful and evocative. Her dream was to dance on a stage someday. Anu could have become a great dancer, but she had to begin work at the age of 12. She had to earn a living with her mother and father, building houses for the rich. Houses she would never live in. Sudha went to a very good play school where she learned how to read, write, and count. She went on excursions to the planetarium, museum, and national parks. She later went to a very good school. She loved painting and started getting private lessons from a famous artist. She later joined a design school and became a well-known painter. Box 4.2, What is poverty? Two scholars, Shaheen Rafi Khan and Damian Killen, put the conditions of the poor in a nutshell: poverty is hunger. Poverty is being sick and not being able to see a doctor. Poverty is not being able to go to school and not knowing how to read. Poverty is not having a job. Poverty is fear for the future, having food once in a day. Poverty is losing a child to illness, brought about by unclear water. Poverty is powerlessness, lack of representation and freedom. What do you think? 4.3 How are poor people identified? If India is to solve the problem of poverty, it has to find viable and sustainable strategies to address the causes of poverty and design schemes to help the poor out of their situation. However, For these schemes to be implemented, the government needs to be able to identify who the poor are. For this there is need to develop a scale to measure poverty, and the factors that make up the criteria for this measurement or mechanism need to be carefully chosen. In pre-independent India, Dadabhai Naoroji was the first to discuss the concept of a poverty line. He used the menu for a prisoner and used appropriate prevailing prices to arrive at what may be called jail cost of living. However, only adults stay in jail, whereas, in an actual society, there are children too. He, therefore, appropriately adjusted this cost of living to arrive at the poverty line. For this adjustment, he assumed that Onet herd population consisted of children and half of them